because a lot of the research, especially that's done by people that don't seem to lift, is failure is a common topic these days. When studies say, well, we have these untrained 65-year-old women, and we had them do 4 sets of 10 squats to failure. And it's like, I don't think that's true momentary muscle failure. But where if you have a rational belief, and you have sort of your dogma or what you believe, regardless of why you believe it, and then often what people do is, when there's rational data indicating A is true instead of B, what they do is they sort of end up in the middle.
Hello, guys and girls. Today we have a very special, dare I say, premium guest here, Menno Henselmans. Hello, Menno. Menno, how have you been lately? And tell us a bit who you are, what you're about, so that listeners get a good idea.
Good, yeah. So my name is Menno Henselmans. I'm Dutch, so probably the German followers can actually pronounce my name, Menno Henselmans. And I haven't been in the Netherlands for a long time. I do a lot of international traveling because I'm a digital nomad, which fits with my job now, which is mainly online coaching, teaching other people how to become online coaches via my certification program. And Thomas leads the German version of that. There's also a French, a Spanish, Dutch, and an English version. And I do scientific research. I'm a book author. And I think that about sums it up. We'll have some side jobs with advisory boards and everything, but peer reviewer. But those are the main things I do.
Cool. So one thing actually I'm very passionate to discuss with you is I know you have a very analytical approach, right? And that's, I think, what makes you very unique in the fitness sphere. We didn't really have someone who has that kind of analytical skills basically in this field. So that's what I think makes you very creative and unique. And one thing that's very common these days, not only these days, but has been for a long time, is the topic of confirmation bias or confirmation biases. So when I started studying psychology, one of the most interesting things that happened to me was basically to understand and learn through research and objective measurements how fundamentally flawed our views can be, right? How very much narrowed down our beliefs, our whole opinions about topics can be. And yeah, essentially how biased we are, even though we might think we're very objective, we look at the situation objectively. So what I wanted to ask you is, what were like moments where you had basically the realization that, okay, the objective data, the evidence, people cling far too long to a certain belief or dogma where the evidence clearly shows a different pictures? What were some of those moments that from your personal or career life that stood out?
I think the first time I had something very profound like that was when studying economics, and I studied behavioral economics. So it's essentially economics that work. Most economic models, as most economists will admit, don't actually make accurate predictions because they assume that people are perfectly rational. And because of these assumptions, they can make nice mathematical models. They go very deep and are very detailed, but they don't actually predict human behavior, which is, of course, a very, very big limitation of the field. And then the field of behavioral economics has emerged as an improvement on standard economics, saying that, oh, look, we can still make accurate models, but we can still make viable mathematical models, but we can also make them empirically accurate, actually capable of predicting human behavior. By, for example, saying, well, humans are generally rational, but we have certain things like confirmation bias, and you can model that. Now, this is, I think, not very groundbreaking. If I tell you this, if I tell it to other people, it's like, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Why did it take 50 years for someone to come up with these ideas? And the problem is that in economics, which is a field that is dominated by a lot of very, very smart people, including a lot of people much smarter than me when it comes to mathematics and economics, they are so entrenched in their beliefs, in what they were taught, what the textbook said 50 years ago, what makes mathematical sense rather than what actually works in practice. So they are continuing to act on these beliefs as if people are perfectly rational, like people are robots, even when that anyone could tell you that is so clearly not the case. And that really made me realize if you have a field of highly educated, very smart, capable people, very successful people, and there is widespread consensus of beliefs that are so blatantly false, then surely this must be the case in a lot of other fields as well. And that was basically how I started in fitness, to basically negate or just sort of wipe from my mind all which I thought was true about certain topics, and just look at all the research that's available and what would I think if I didn't know anything. I just looked at these data. So that's what I did, and that's been a hallmark of how I approach fitness. And then you can see that a lot of things, one of the first articles, for example, was on protein intake, where there was, especially at that time, still widespread consensus that 1 gram per pound was the minimum, and often sometimes 2 grams per pound, which would need per day for optimal muscle growth. And the research very clearly showed 1.6 gram per kilogram per day was as much as you needed. Had been a multitude of studies consistently, time and time again, showing higher intakes do not provide further muscle growth or strength development. And people just didn't accept it. And even now, it's, you can see that what's called, what's his name? Daniel, I don't know, also a behavioral psychologist. He calls it flunking, filching, where if you have a certain, you have a rational belief and you have sort of your dogma or what you believe regardless of why you believe it. And then often what people do is when there's rational data indicating A is true instead of B, what they do is they sort of end up in the middle.
Yeah.
So people don't actually just go like, that makes perfect sense. I guess what I've been thinking all along is wrong. This is what I think now. Actually, they're like, well, you know, there's this other stuff that's not true, but still I believe, and they end up in the middle.
They have to consider how they felt before and include that. Yeah, that's super interesting. So because that always stood out to me as well, that even the smartest people can be like stupid, right? In the sense that they don't see certain things that other people see, which speaks to our basically our brain anatomy even, so that even if you have a high IQ, you can still be completely wrong and just have a better bullshit story essentially, right? Or pick out facts that make a different story. So
I often think that you can think of someone's sort of capacity for intelligence, or someone's actionable intelligence, someone's real intelligence, economists might say, as a multiplier of their rationality and their IQ. So IQ alone is rather useless if you can't be rational about when you're using it. And you know, you need both. So there are actually a lot of people that are very reasonable. They're not necessarily very smart, but they're very reasonable, and they're intelligent enough to do the things that they need to do, and therefore they become very successful in their field. Whereas other people that are very intelligent, but they just don't have the hustle, basically, the real life,
the wisdom,
applicability,
right?
And the wisdom to apply their intelligence in novel ways, where they just side with dogma or conventions, so that they just don't use their intelligence well.
That's very interesting. So you said you have a very, very analytical, very scientific approach. So you approach these topics very like blank slate. Let's look at the evidence. That takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of skill. That also takes, you know, a very open mindset, I guess. What sort of to just like as an overview, if you look at all the exercise and nutrition research, what would you say are like problems that we have with exercise research that can't really be bridged, where you do have to consider, you know, your experience working with clients? How do you integrate all of that? Where are the problems? Where are the gaps? How do you make the picture whole?
There are definitely a few fields where I feel just going by the science won't cut it. And it's also important to have experience when interpreting research, because a lot of the research, especially that's done by people that don't seem to lift, is, you know, failure is a common topic these days. When studies say, well, you know, we have these untrained 65-year-old women, and we had them do 4 sets of 10 squats to failure. And it's like, I don't think that's true momentary muscle failure. Plus, that statement itself, which you see in some papers, is actually inherently contradictory, because either you're doing sets to failure or you're doing 4 sets of 10. right? You can't guarantee that you're doing 4 sets of 10 if you're training to failure. In fact, it's physiologically almost impossible to do 4 sets of 10 if the first set of 10 was to failure, because then the next set you should be fatigued. So it should be like 4, 9, 7, 6 or something. So you see statements like that often, and then you have to go like, oh, well, I think we have to take that failure with a grain of salt. And, you have to take that into account in how you interpret the study. But I think the 2 fields probably that are the most, or where science is the least reaching so far, is diet adherence and injury management. I think those fields are, I can definitely say I've learned more from just getting injured than from all the scientific research I've read on rehabilitation and physiotherapy. And this research gives you a very good theoretical base. Of course, you are way better off when you know both. You've had the injuries, you've coached people who had injuries, and you have the theoretical knowledge so that you can conceptualize what's going on when you, in practice think, okay, this works, this does not work, and then you can think of why that is. But if you just learn the science, especially if you go to a physiotherapist that doesn't do strength training, I think you'll get very, very bad advice. In fact, that's what I've seen so often. In fact, it's so rare that I have any client that goes to a physical therapist and they come back and they say what the diagnosis, and I'm like, that makes perfect sense. Like probably 9 times out of 10, unfortunately. I'm like, I literally think that's so far out there. Without even having diagnosed you in person, I can pretty much safely say that is not an accurate diagnosis.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, here it's somewhat 50-50. If you have you definitely need to make sure if you go to a physiotherapist that he lifts himself. In Austria, you have to definitely make sure that he himself is a lifter. Otherwise, he's like, don't do anything, just do this grandma exercises and you will be fine, right? But it's definitely like you really need to find the right person if you want to be serious with a physiotherapist. But yeah, that's a whole different topic. Let's dive a little bit deeper in one specific topic that at least I get very often questions about, is about strength and muscle size, right? So we know from the research that, as all else being equal, all other factors aside, a bigger muscle is going to be a stronger muscle. Like a bigger engine is going to be more performant if we don't consider anything else. So that is why we often recommend people who are starting out or are like very early intermediates to just focus on getting stronger, just focus on getting stronger overall. You hear certain strength standards being thrown around, like as soon as you hit your, 200-pound bench or like 100-kilo bench for a few reps, your chest is going to be there. You look like you lift. As soon as you can do 15 pull-ups, you look like you lift. For some people, it's true. For others, it's not. Right. So I think Abel Chabai did a really good video on this, where he compared certain physiques and looked at their strength levels. And it was like there was a correlation, but it's not perfect, right, between how you look and how you perform. So how do we make sense of this? And what maybe are the downsides of like exclusively focusing on strength as a trainee, even if muscle growth is the goal? What are your thoughts on the whole topic?
Yeah, I think those statements are very simplified, but definitely have a lot of truth. But they are based on a lot of underlying assumptions. For example, if you tell people, don't worry about trying to isolate the upper tertiary fibers of the pecs and the inner pecs and whatever before your bench press 200 pounds. And I mean, there's some truth to that. But if you just literally tell people, if you bench 200 pounds, you'll be, intermediate, and if you bench 300, you'll have a nice chest, that definitely won't hold, because you can build a lot of strength with 1RM training, and that builds very little muscle. So it really depends. Often the underlying assumption is that you do a sort of moderate bodybuilding-esque kind of training. And if you train like a bodybuilder and you gain a lot of strength, then strength and size are pretty well correlated. But if you train like a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter even more, and then you gain a lot of strength, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to gain a lot of muscle. So you already mentioned engine, and that's an analogy I think is very good to illustrate how strength and size relate. You can think of your muscles as, or you can think of strength as the speed of a race car, and your muscle size is like the size of the engine. So a bigger engine has the capacity for faster driving, but it also depends on the skill of the driver. The driver is like the motor cortex in your brain. It's the part of your brain that controls movement, and also parts of the nerve system in like the rest of your body, the nerves themselves, nerve conduction, velocity, some spinal cord modulations. But mostly you can think of it as how good the brain is at controlling muscles and how big the muscles are. And together, those determine how fast you are. So you can gain a lot of strength by making the driver, your brain, better at doing its job. And you can do that with speed work, 1RM training, just very focused attention to specific exercises that you want to get stronger at. Because we think of strength as a trait, but it's actually a skill. You can have a strong bench press. You can't really be strong. Yeah. We tend to think of like a powerlifter as strong, but they may perform horribly at Olympic weightlifting. I think actually CrossFit sort of tried to fill that gap. But the best, I would say, like measure of overall strength, if we have to use some measure, is strongman training. Yeah. Because if you're very good at strongman training, then you're pretty beastly as a person.
Oh yeah, you can lift heavy shit, right? Essentially.
Yeah, your endurance is also good, and your 1RM is good. Your strength endurance is good. You need a pretty full package.
Yeah, that's true. Like, just out of curiosity, what sort of strength numbers have you like observed in your clients? Like, sort of like, if we ask from your experience, like, what sort of strength levels do people really have like impressive physiques in terms of like, if we look overall population and then impressive physiques? I know we're very different in that, like in the fitness people, they have other standards, but in terms of like, oh, this is a very well-trained person compared to an average person, what are sort of like strength standards that you have observed that people would need to have probably with typical bodybuilding strength style training, that basically are the, like, if we term it like a threshold of where they look like they live probably or most likely?
I mean, I think
you have like
some super general guidelines. I think one of the oldest guidelines of all is actually one of the best for men. I think for women, you can take about 70% of these, 75, and you'll have pretty decent numbers based on the literature on sex differences. They suggest that it's actually can be like 80, 85, but in practice, I think because of the generally lower body weights, you're better off taking like 70%. The 300, 400, 500. So 300 bench press, 400-pound squat, 500-pound deadlift. If you get those numbers and you don't look like you lift, then you definitely don't have genetics for Mr. Olympia. And I think very few people will easily hit those numbers if they do have decent genes and still not look good. But yeah, again, it's contingent on not training like a powerlifter, because you could hit those numbers and still not be that great if you really focus just on the power lifts. But I think they're pretty good. And in fact, if you look at the an article I never really published, I might still do that, is looking at the records, historical records of the pre-drug era, and looking at what records were at those times. So that also gives you a decent clue, because there are a lot of people have very, very different views on this. Some people say if you have a 300-pound bench press, that's like average in the soccer team or the football team, American football team. It's like, yeah, but so many of those are on drugs, or they're like 120 kilos because they're basically fat, which is good for their sport, but not representative of the average gym goer. And if you really look at how long it took people to bench like 300, squat 400, that was quite a while. There were quite a lot of people doing that. And overhead press as well, body weight overhead press, that's really solid. If you do that with strict form, not turning it into a push press, that is super solid. Many people won't be able to come over that without very dedicated training or at all, depending on your genetics. And sure, there are some people that went above that, but if you look at these kind of historical records, these are pretty good. And if you just look around in commercial gyms as well, like I'm not that strong, but in many commercial gyms, I'm literally the strongest guy in the gym. Yeah. So it's very what kind of reference you're using.
Absolutely, that's very interesting. Yeah, So I would also maybe comment on this, that you really have to look at, okay, can I somewhat deadlift 400, or do I really well, like good sets with like 380 for reps, and is it like very controlled, very I can handle the weight, or is it like just, oh, I want to get this 400, right, 1RM. So it's a very different strength level also, if we talk about 1RM strength or working weight.
Yeah.
All right, so let's switch the topic a little bit. You are very passionate about education, so that's something I find very inspiring as well. And you recently wrote a book, right, about self-control. So guys, if you're interested in psychology, in self-control, in general, just being awesome at life, just get Menno's book. It's called The Science of Self-Control. You can get it on Amazon, very cheap, but insane value for that money. And you go very deep into certain topics, from training to nutrition to productivity, right? And one of the most, I find, interesting quotes from the book, where I think you were analyzing students and what made students of like even elite universities successful or not. And you were basically arguing that the most successful students, they just Google shit.
Yes.
So do you want to expand a little bit on that? Like, what's the reasoning behind that, the idea there?
That's actually, I came up with the ideas at University College Utrecht, which is an international honors college of the Utrecht University, which is in itself the best university in the Netherlands based on most academic lists. So it's sort of the creme de la creme of if you want to get like the best university in the Netherlands, that's where you go. It's not even known in most places. It's more like a niche field where some students go. And you could really tell that those students were different in a lot of ways. And of course, they had better grades. On average, they're a bit more intelligent, but that definitely wasn't the main thing. And when I, talked to a lot of people that studied there, a lot of my co-students and other students from other universities, and just people in general in daily life, I found that the biggest differentiator, which was actually an extremely powerful differentiator for something so simple, is that if you ask them something they don't know, they will Google it. Like literally, if you ask someone at UCU, like, I wonder in what year Columbus did this and this, they'll be like, oh, and look it up in their phone. Like before you've even, asked them. Well, other people are like, yeah, that's interesting. I wonder,
Yeah, exactly.
And with a lot of stuff like that. So that mindset is actually just like being reasonable and using your intelligence properly, I think a lot more important than just being very intelligent. So I thought that was another one of those epiphany moments for me.
That's really interesting. So basically the mindset that whatever life throws at me, I can figure it out, right? So many psychologists maybe would call this self-efficacy, I suppose, or like the general belief in your capabilities to deal with the stuff that life throws at you, intellectually, physically, socially, right? So, and then the topic of the book is mainly self-control. I'm just curious, like if you maybe want to tell the listeners, how did you, first of all, maybe develop the love of learning very deeply about this topic, and why the topic of self-control?
I think self-control is one of those topics that's so fundamental for so many things that it's something that I kept coming back to in terms of, pushing out extra reps in the gym, diet adherence, being rational with those economists. Like all of these things seem to come down to certain features that in our brain share one fundamental core process. A lot of economic decisions as well. The whole essence of most difficult economic decisions, spending wisely, often comes down to investing versus consuming. And if you think about it, all of these things come back to self-control ability. Self-control ability is needed to forsake immediate gratification and get better long-term gains. And you need that in the gym because you're suffering now to look better later. You need that with diet adherence because you may suffer now, you make difficult choices now to look better and be healthier later. You need that when investing with economics to maybe invest money in something now rather than spend it and get a good return on investment later. So there are a lot of these topics, studying, procrastination as well, that all come down to self-control. So it's more that there were so many things that I'm interested in that came back to this same topic that I started learning about it from many different angles. And I didn't really intend on writing the book about self-control until like probably 2 years, 3 years after I had many different topics that I already knew I was going to write about and probably publish in book form. And then I thought, okay, this is a great overarching theme. And then I tied it all together in writing it the past years.
Cool. So you go a lot into basically self. So from what I understand, you basically were searching for like common denominators and found that self-control boiled down to be one of the most important skills or brain functions, I guess, if you want to call it that, or brain assets that we have in making decisions. Like often you hear people throw around like produce versus consume, or invest versus consume. And I think that's a very fitting metaphor. So you talk a lot about productivity in the book. Maybe I want to hit this from a different angle and say like, okay, someone might criticize, okay, productivity, right? How does relaxation fit into this? Is relaxing important? How do you fit in stress management if you always want to be productive? What are your thoughts just on that? If someone says like, how do you relax? Or what does relaxation fit?
I think that's one of those things that in our current society is very misunderstood about being productive. We tend to associate productivity with very disciplinary approach. Someone that, Arnold Schwarzenegger is probably the paragon of productivity for a lot of people. He's successful in a lot of different fields. He is renowned for saying he only sleeps 6 hours a day because you don't need more. He's renowned for saying if you don't, or you shouldn't even have a plan B because you should just work harder to make sure your plan A succeeds. And he has a lot of other quotes, no pain, no gain, those kind of things. And I think a lot of people have that mindset, which can work for people like him. But for most people, research actually finds that the people that are most successful are the people that rely the least on their self-control. And actually a concept called bounded rationality that are good at mitigating whatever limitations their brain has. And we all have lots of limitations, like we all procrastinate. We all succumb to temptation sometimes. So no one is a perfectly rational robot. And the people that are more successful generally are better capable of realizing what their own limitations are and how to prevent relying on those, because those are your weak spots, essentially.
Okay, so if you say weak spots, that to me, that sounds very much like you have to understand how your brain works and then do some sort of like even pain management, right? Because your brain tends to...
No, it's more like if you know you are prone to procrastination, for example, and you're prone to being distracted, then you have to pay extra focus to reduce distractors in your study room when you're working, etc. And the more you're prone to end up on Instagram, the more you may benefit from something like an Instagram blocker on your phone. So it's more like that. It's more metaphorical.
I see. So I remember for one title, I think was why Obama only wear 2 types of suits, if I remember correctly, or had only one type of clothing or something. Is that on a similar note, like you have to control your environment so that you don't have to make extra decisions, you don't...
That's about reducing decision fatigue. Basically saying you don't want to spend any cognitive resources or time or effort thinking about trivial stuff, especially if you have an important job like Obama, which had a kind of important job. Then you want to make sure that all of your attention goes to things that really matter. And then you can apply that concept to your diet as well, for example, by just streamlining everything, having a meal plan, having things planned out in advance, knowing what you're going to eat, so that you don't constantly have to think, what am I going to eat? I have to go to the supermarket to get it. No, you just know, okay, it's lunchtime. This is what I'm going to eat. Ideally, you just get a Tupperware container and you microwave it, or at least you have the ingredients ready to make something right now. And that frees up a lot of mental space to spend on other things.
Cool. So let me get back to what you said, like that actually the most successful people need the least, discipline and like,
Mhm.
hard approach. That to me almost sounds like they have more fun, or they have like, they're happier. So my
Mhm.
question would be, how does happiness play into this? Or even like, what do you understand as happiness? How do you define happiness? Is it hedonism? Is it more of a long-term fulfillment? What is happiness to you, and what are your thoughts on this?
I think actually people that sort of get it, they do have more fun in a way, and
Mhm.
they relax more. In fact, if you look at Erickson's research on top performers, which is also where the sort of the 10,000 hour rule comes from, violinists and a lot of other fields,
Mhm.
chess players, even Morse code operators, research on those. You see that the people that excel the most, they take more breaks and they work very focused when they are working, but they actually take a lot of breaks. You see this concept in a lot of research, in military research on ultra rhythms of attention, the traditional lengths of Hollywood movies. You see it in almost all academic settings that you don't get 4-hour classes. Nobody pays productive attention during a 4-hour class. The teacher is not productive during a 4-hour lesson. You need breaks. And taking those breaks actually reinvigorates you so much that you can be much more productive in those other hours than if you just kept going. Because at a certain point, you just hit rock bottom. You really don't do much anymore. One of the favorite findings of the book is that the average office worker is only productive for about 3 hours a day. And in some research, even I think 2 hours or 1 hour, 53 minutes, I think in one survey. And that just goes to show, it's like 2 good work bouts, which you often also see, it's like lunchtime and mornings, and the rest of the day, people at some point they're kind of zoned out, and you answer like 1 email per 3 hours. You think you're productive, but when you really think back afterwards on what did you really objectively accomplish during the last 5 hours, then you often feel like, okay, yeah, actually, I didn't do that much. I felt like I was constantly occupied, and you were drained the whole time, so you felt stressed. But if you actually just took a break, did something fun in between, you could have and had fun and finished your work a lot earlier. And to look back to happiness and self-control ability are very, very tightly linked. In fact, the more you enjoy doing something, the less you have to rely on self-control to keep doing it. And that's one of the fundamental findings that basically killed the traditional interpretation of self-control as like some limited resource that we have to draw on, like the Baumeister model in psychology, where it's almost like a fat, something in your brain, and you can just tap into it, and at some point it's empty. It cannot explain why, if you do enjoy something, the vat doesn't seem to drain, for example. And it's because the brain starts looking. What self-control failure is that the brain starts looking for more immediate source of gratification. So essentially, it is forced failure of maintaining attention, where the brain at some point just says, we cannot give more attention to what you're doing right now. We're going to give it to something else. And if you're enjoying something, you don't need that, because what you're doing is giving you immediate gratification. So happiness and productivity are very tightly linked. And there are not many people, I think, long-term who can just kill themselves like Schwarzenegger style. You really need that super, like Arnold Schwarzenegger's focus was insane for everything he did. He had an extremely competitive, strong focus. I think most people don't have that soul drive to just, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences, you're going to be the best bodybuilder, you're going to excel in Hollywood, you're going to be a top politician, etc.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So that self-control, yeah, the typical model many people have that you have to willpower through is very misled. It's not wrong, like it's misled. It's come from the wrong place, right? Because it is limited, but it's just misled. So yeah,
it's psychologically limited. It's not physically limited.
That's exactly. That's super interesting. So so that if I understood correctly, if you switch, so basically your brain senses this is the wrong type of stimulation now. We need some different stimulation or gratification, if we will. and then you switch to something, even if it's effortful, maybe like a game you're playing or practicing, then it is the right kind of stimulation which you can keep on doing for hours. I think that's super valuable. Like I find this with training, right? So I'm super brain dead from working or from reading, and then I feel drained, and I go train. It's like a reset, and it's like a super hard stimulation, but it's a different stimulation, right?
Exactly. And training has actually been shown in research to, for example, stimulate creativity a lot. And creativity and happiness are also very tight linked. If you have a creative job, then happiness is even more important. I think there's more recognition for that. For creative jobs where they say, take a walk, sleep over it. We have all these kind of phrases that already suggest just grinding through and like conjuring up creativity doesn't work. In fact, I think almost for like artists and very creative type jobs, there's almost no point in even trying to just do it. You need to stimulate it a bit more indirectly, like immerse yourself with related ideas, read a lot, just get a lot of ideas and let it ponder over in different settings, and then see what your brain comes up with. Because you can't just say like, okay, creative ideas now, next 4 hours, we're gonna get creative ideas. And funny enough, that's actually what a lot of people try, right? Brainstorming sessions. The only benefit of that is that you do get people in the room, like you do actually get their attention because they have to.
Stuff.
Right, but it's really not productive. It's really not the best way to come up with new ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting. The best ideas often come like, you wake up, you have an idea, right, randomly during the day.
You hear that with almost anyone, like with top ideas. It's never someone said like, how did you come up with that idea? It's like, well, after 4 hours of brainstorming, I finally had it.
It's not like you work on it consciously. So that's interesting. One idea or one topic that comes to mind is that research also generally finds, like in positive psychology research, you find that the people that report the most happiness in their life, they tend to actually also experience a lot of positive emotions each day, right? So it's literally just a correlation. It's not like you have to grind all the way. Like if you really don't enjoy it at least a little bit every day, if you don't have spikes of euphoria or, dare I say, like just a good mood every day, at least a little bit, then what you're doing is probably not working long term. Even if you think it will pay up, probably it's like the wrong approach. We don't know for sure, but probably, right? And
I think for happiness, there's also because you earlier you asked about what I define as happiness. And psychological research often finds you can distinguish, or happiness is sort of a two-component construct, where you can define it as either what's more accurately defined as life satisfaction, or what's more accurately defined as subjective well-being. So what you just described, actually feeling positive emotions, is subjective well-being. And that's indeed most correlated with actually the sensation of happiness. Whereas a lot of people strive more for things that are related to life satisfaction, things that increase their life satisfaction, but don't actually result in positive emotions. So they don't increase subjective well-being, like money. The relationship with money and life satisfaction is very strong. The relationship with subjective well-being and money is not strong, and basically disappears altogether after your income is about 80K a year. So after that point, you're just climbing the hedonic treadmill, as psychologists would say, where you're just going to need more and more to actually get the same experience and sensations.
The hedonic treadmill. It's like too much dopamine. It's not good. It's not sustainable. Too much hedonism, right? It's good. So you have to keep in mind the frequency and intensity of rewarding things. It's something I was thinking about. All right. Let's get into some Instagram questions I got, and then I think we're through with everything we wanted to talk about. Someone asked, best way to combine strength and endurance training. How would you go about that?
So that question basically comes down to how to minimize the interference effect. Because
strength
training and endurance training, when you do them together, they essentially interfere with each other. It's also called the concurrent training effect. It's like you're trying to pull your body into two opposite directions to be stronger or have better endurance. It's a very imperfect metaphor, but it's a bit like you have a garden hose, and with strength, it's like telling the body to get a bigger hose. Like we need more water output. And endurance is a bit like we need a more sustainable eco hose to, give long-term water output without breaking down. And those are kind of opposites. Now in the body, they're a bit more compatible, but especially when you try to do both at the same time, it doesn't work well. So like AMPK and mTOR and various other anabolic and catabolic type stimuli, they interfere with each other's signaling. So a big or a very important thing you can do is not to have the adaptation processes or the recovery phases of both workouts overlap. And research finds that especially the first 4 hours are quite crucial. So you don't want to do them in the same session, endurance and strength training. You want to separate the sessions, ideally, basically as much as possible. So if you have, for example, 4 strength training workouts, and you do endurance training as well, you want to do those on different days. So probably 3 days endurance training, 4 days strength training, something like that. If you do have to combine them, it depends on how you want to do the endurance training. If you're actually developing endurance, or you're doing it on the same day, strength training first is generally better, because strength training also creates an endurance stimulus. It also leads to substrate depletion and fatigue. And so it doesn't really interfere with building endurance, whereas endurance training can create central nervous system fatigue, actual central nervous system fatigue, muscle damage, and substrate depletion that interfere with the next workout, the strength training workout. So endurance training interferes more with strength training than strength training interferes with endurance training. Modality is also important. Well, if you're trying to build endurance, then you just have a chosen sport. And if you want to be good at bicycling, for example, you need to do bicycling. And it's important not to do too much other stuff, because the gains of that will be, you'll have a lot of interference, whereas only indirect conversion to your actual end goal. If you do running, but you want to be good at bicycling, then you get a big interference effect, but still not direct conversion to being a better bicyclist.
I see.
So those, I think, are the main ways to reduce the interference effect. And then there's of course, volume and periodization and everything. I think those are the most important ones.
Okay, so in short, separate as much as possible. If you have them on the same day, do strength training first. If they're, okay, let's say strength training midday or something, noon, like afternoon or evening, you do endurance training. So would you have a big meal between that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you want to avoid, especially for the strength training, you want to avoid being very depleted.
Yeah, great. I think that answers it really well. Okay, another more psychological question. How do you find the motivation to work out after a long day of work? How would you approach that? Someone asked.
I think often it's not so much at finding the motivation, but at building the routines and the habits. Because I don't really enjoy going to the gym, just like I don't really enjoy taking a shower or brushing my teeth. It's not like I'm like, yeah, I want to, take a shower. Very sometimes, but when I'm doing any of those things, especially afterwards, I'll feel better. So I do them. And I don't think about doing them. I don't ask myself every day, am I going to take a shower? And just like that, I also don't ask myself every time I want to go to the gym, do I really want to go to the gym? Why am I doing this? You just go because you know your life's better when you're doing it. And when you've built it as a routine and a habit, it doesn't matter if you're motivated anymore, because you're just doing it. And it's just part of your routine. So I think building routines like that is very important. You also don't want to give yourself time to wind down. So after work, I found that the best approach is go straight after work. Because when you get home, you start sitting on the couch. If you feel like, I'm just going to take a little break, that ends up being a long break. And often you're going to stay on that couch. So it works best to just take your gym stuff to work, go straight after work to the gym, also better for the evening crowds. Just do the workout, then you come home, then you relax. Having a meal beforehand and using caffeine can also help a lot. In fact, a trick that I mentioned in the book is to take your pre-workout before, as a rule for yourself. Always take your pre-workout, caffeine. You can include other stuff, but caffeine is the basis. And only after like an hour, you can decide if you don't want to work out. Because often that's like, you can always do that. You can tell yourself you're going to take a shot of energy drink. And then after an hour, usually you feel better. So if you work from 9 to 5, at say 4:30 or 4, you take your pre-workout, and then if at 5 you still really don't want to go, then you can stay home. And
so
often then you find,
okay.
often then you find that when you have those rules for yourself, which are relatively low effort, then people do end up going.
Yeah, that's interesting. So basically a hyper focus on routine and planning the day before even, and then even giving yourself plausible deniability with the energy drink. I'm going to drink the energy drink. And if I really feel like, because maybe on some days it really was a very, very intense day. Even if we do like manual labor, of course, maybe it was really, really actually physically demanding and not only mentally. So
in those days, you should probably also consider training first in the morning.
Yeah, if you have a manually demanding job, definitely. Okay, and then one more question, a little bit of a deeper question. So let me know if it goes too far. I would be interested if more came out of the well microbiome and mouse skeletal muscle adaptation study. Okay, so a mouse skeletal and muscle adaptation study with the microbiome. Yeah. And she wants to know if there was a mechanism of action that was suggested, for example, energy availability through nutrition. So short chain fatty acid formation through microbiome would lead to a better energy availability. Okay, so I guess, you got the question. So
I think so. I posted about a study not too long ago showing that, at least in rodents, disruption of the gut microbiome, by, for example, using antibiotics, can actually disrupt muscle growth. So if you give rats antibiotics and then you have them work out, there are ways you can make rats work out on a treadmill, and you can make them press levers. And researchers have become very clever at making rats work out.
No overhead press though.
That's well, there are these contraptions where they sort of have to avoid being squashed, basically, but it's more like a squat than an overhead press. So, but in any case, you can make rodents work out, and when they try that after taking antibiotics, they gain less muscle than otherwise. So, in most of these core physiological traits humans share with rodents, especially with like base muscle physiology, that's millions of years of evolution. Many of these things haven't changed that much. So if you talk about like sugar metabolism in detail, then it's going to be different. But these things, there's pretty good reason to believe similar principles would hold in humans. What the exact mechanisms are is still unclear, but there is a lot of research now that identifies pretty strong links between the immune system and the brain, like the vagus nerve, and the overall muscle itself actually secretes a lot of adipocoins and other compounds that are essentially immune system compounds. So the muscle system and the immune system and the gut are actually quite intricately linked. So a lot of things, there are a lot of plausible mechanisms, at least. And that's definitely an area where I think we're going to see a lot more research, because now we know that, well, your gut microbiome actually can influence your energy expenditure, but not much. Like there are a lot of people who say like these things that just don't matter. They do matter, but only a few percent, like for energy expenditure. So for fat loss, it's not major. Maybe if you're talking antibiotics, these percentages might increase, but in most circumstances, it's like a few percent. But for muscle growth, there's actually pretty good reason to believe it might be more than that. And we also have a lot of research showing that high inflammation can decrease muscle growth. So if you have impaired gut microbiome health, we know that can cause inflammation. And well, you have one link there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know from psychological research, there's some very funky stuff going on with microbiomes, where if you take the gut microbiome from a depressed mouse and put it into a healthy mouse, it will get depressed. And depressed is measured basically by how long they resist when drowning, right? They instantly give up if they're depressed, I guess, right? It's also very ethically questionable, but which also makes it like, wow, it's just links that the gut microbiome is just a lot of
their gut microbiome and happiness also have pretty tight links. I didn't know you could actually, with a fecal transplant,
Yeah, with the fecal transplant.
make changes that big, but the links are pretty strong. And I think in nutrition we do see that, where a lot of diets, for example, people that claim ketogenic diets are the holy grail, or carnivore diets are the holy grail of nutrition. Very often I found that these people have FODMAP intolerances, so they don't tolerate certain fermentable carbohydrates.
Bloated,
and it's just a gut health concern. But in principle, or in turn, better gut health means they're not as bloated and gassy and distended in the abdomen, so they look leaner, and it doesn't impact actual fat mass. And well, let's assume it doesn't impact muscle mass, but maybe like based on this research, it can actually have an effect. But even if it's just a psychological well-being effect, that in turn can make you push harder in the gym, improve diet adherence.
Yeah.
Right. So
I see.
Many of these things I think are practically very important, even if they're not directly influencing our body composition that much.
That's interesting. Yeah. Or maybe even directly if you have more energy availability at the right time due to a healthy gut microbiome, I guess.
Possibly,
Possibly, yeah. Speculative. Okay, well, I think that sums it up beautifully. That was a cool topic. Menno, how can people contact you, find out more about you, stalk you, whatever?
MennoHensemans.com has everything. On Facebook and Instagram. As Menno Hensemans on Instagram, there's a dot in between because someone took Menno Hensemans already. Probably best way if you haven't read anything or you're not subscribed yet, is to follow my newsletter, because then you get sort of a tour of my most popular contents, a lot of free stuff, like a lot of high quality free stuff. Normally these newsletters are like 7 days, and then we give you the we spam you with what we really want to sell you, but this is like a lot of, I think, high quality free content, and then we spam you with my book and stuff.
Yes. So buy Menno's book, sign up for his newsletter. It's good, high quality content. Thank you, Menno, so much for the interview, for your time. I appreciate it. And thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.